Well, hello from Wellington, New Zealand, the coolest little capital in the world. We are streaming to you live from the BizDojo and Collider Wellington, which is a co-working and collaboration hive of innovation where people are hot desking their blue sky ideas into ideas, then projects that really fly. I'm Palace Hupe Cotter, and I am very happy to be hosting this first in a series of 3 conversations of Open Data New Zealand, and you are actually probably on your screens right now seeing our first guest, Joel Gurin. We also have a picture of you showing you as our rock star of the day, Joel, so I'm going to read your many titles as I get into that. He is the author of Open Data Now, and this is a book that sort of introduces the idea of open data, which some say could impact our lives as much as the invention of the World Wide Web. Joel is also a senior consultant on open data to the World Bank. He is also president and founder of the Center for Open Data Enterprise and led the launch team for GovLab's Open Data 500 project and the Open Data Roundtables. Joel, that is a mouthful, and I know you've agreed to talk with us today, and I just want to sort of, yes, and I want to assure the people who are watching that if your head is spinning already, don't worry. The whole point of this Google Hangout is to translate open data to those of us who are not open data experts. So Joel, I'm the sacrificial lamb, and I'll be asking you questions that others might be afraid to ask for fear of appearing ill-informed or uninformed, but that's the whole point, to get informed. So thank you for joining us, and you're joining us from another capital city.
Yes, I'm here in Washington, D.C. at the OpenGov Hub, which is a wonderful workspace that has about 30 organizations focused on open government and open data.
So it's happening all around you.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's all open data all the time here.
So with that said, I think we should probably define open data.
Sure. So they're both technical and sort of functional definitions of open data. Technically, it means data that's available for anybody to use, reuse, republish. It should be free or at least at very low cost. And it should be ideally machine readable, meaning it's in a form like a file that can be downloaded and that computers can use without humans having to input all that data. So that's a kind of technical definition, but more functionally, it's a very, very powerful tool. I talk about it in my book, Open Data Now, as data that can help people identify major social and economic trends. It can help people launch new ventures. It can help people make data-driven decisions, and it can help solve very complex problems in business, in the economy, or in the public sector as well.
And that's very much a point that probably people in this room or this building right now will be interested in, because as I understand it, it is really a solution for smart business leaders, and I think that might be a sort of quote from you. I haven't probably got it exactly right, but it's going back to the idea of what data should be in order to be considered open, and one of the things is readable. This isn't just a word, is it? That is actually a complex concept, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a technical concept that may or may not be that complex, but basically here's what it does not mean. It does not mean that if you get a government form and you fill it out and the government keeps a PDF of your form, whether it's a business registration or whatever, in a file somewhere, and then maybe they scan the PDF and now it's in some computer's hard drive somewhere. That's not really open data, or at best it's a very low-class form of open data. Data has to be usable, and as anybody knows, if you've ever tried to do anything with a bunch of PDF files and try to analyze them, trying to do that either through optical scanning or just by hand entering the data is extraordinarily difficult. So it should be, machine readability simply means it should be in something like an Excel file or a spreadsheet or something that can be downloaded and fed into a computer for analysis very easily.
And it's interesting that you said it doesn't necessarily have to be complex, because we were having this discussion actually while we were waiting for today's Hangout, and that is that the technology is there. That isn't the issue, is it?
No, not at all. The technology is very much there, and as I said, the difference between a downloadable Excel file and a PDF is huge, and it's not like an Excel file is beyond most people's technical capacity. So even just getting to that basic threshold makes a huge difference. But amazingly enough, in countries around the world, including the U.S., we still have an awful lot of data in this very primitive form. So there's a lot of work going on now to try to make it much more accessible, much more useful, more quickly.
I think it was the minister, land information minister here, who said that this is going to require a culture shift, not a technology shift. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Absolutely. You know, there's a phenomenon that in the U.S. here we refer to as data hugging disorder. This is government agencies that say, no, no, this is my data. You will never get my data. Because, you know, there's been a tradition where, at least in our government, but we see this in many places, there's been a real fear of releasing data that might not be absolutely perfect or might not be absolutely usable. And since most data has some kind of flaw in it, it's just sort of the nature of the game, a lot of agencies have been very, very reluctant to release data that really would have great public use. There's also, I think, a kind of control factor. I mean, it is true that once you let data out into the real world, people will analyze it, they'll talk about it, they'll have opinions about it that you can't control. But that's really the point. The point of open data is to democratize data and to make it possible for anybody to look at this really great resource of information and do with it what they think is going to be most productive and most interesting.
Well, you mentioned fear, and that is a very powerful word in many arenas, but in this arena, I think it's particularly important, not just because of being wrong, but also for fear of being liable or releasing something you're not supposed to, which leads me into some of the second list of questions here, and that is privacy. This is one of the first objections that comes up. So, you know, there is a minefield, a treasure trove, depending on how you look at it, of information in this data. So how do you protect people's privacy?
Well, you know, that's a really critical question right now. I should mention, you mentioned that I'm head of this new organization called the Center for Open Data Enterprise. We work a lot both with international governments. One of our team has been out in New Zealand, I know, more than once, and we're very interested in working internationally, but we also work a lot with the U.S. federal government, and a project we're now doing with the White House is a series of roundtables and research papers that will get at some of the key issues in open data, and the first one we're dealing with is privacy, because this is the one that many people say, if we don't solve this, we're cooked. We can't do anything. What we're finding in the preliminary work on this is that there's a lot of approaches. There are technologies that can remove identification from even sensitive data sets. There are ways of making data open in what some people are calling a semi-open way, where it's only open to qualified researchers or under certain kinds of conditions. And there are other kinds of approaches as well that can be very, very useful. None of them is necessarily foolproof or, you know, all pros and no cons, but they make it manageable. And the reason to make the privacy issue manageable is that if we can begin releasing more and more of this data that might have sensitive information about patients' medical records or financial records or even transportation records, if we can find safe ways to release that and let people analyze it, there's incredible benefits, particularly in medicine. Being able to analyze millions of patient records together with people's genomic data and what came out of different kinds of treatments for different people, this could revolutionize medicine in the next 10 years more than any lab research we could hope to do.
Well, and I'd like to discuss that more with you, but I'll just bring up one thing that is important in a country the size of New Zealand, about 4.4 million people, and that is, although data is aggregated, that in the process of drilling down, you can, in some cases by process of elimination, identify people, for example, their medical records, and somehow unmask their identity, even though all the safeguards are in place. So how do you deal with a complexity like that?
That's really the kind of million-dollar question right now. Nobody has a real answer to that. I mean, the thing that people talk about is de-identification technologies, or they're also called anonymization technologies, where there are ways to strip out that information, but they're not foolproof, and anybody will tell you they're not foolproof. So we're really facing, I think, some very difficult but very important kinds of public policy choices here. If it was simply a question of, do you want to release these data and expose people's privacy, private information, of course the answer would be no. But if I were to say, well, if we do that, we're going to improve treatment efficacy for diabetes, heart disease, and cancer by about 100%, it becomes a very different calculation. It may be that we're going to go towards a voluntary system, sort of like organ donation, where people decide if they want to make their data available, they will. If not, they don't. All I can tell you is it's a very, very active discussion right now. This is probably about the most important conversation happening in the open data community. But I'm very confident that there are going to be solutions and that we're going to find ways to balance the risk reduction that we need to do to keep people's expectation of privacy pretty reasonable against the incredible social benefit that can come from this.
Well, it's the philosophy of the greater good in that instance until the privacy issues are solved. But let's get into the greater good, because you did mention the benefits to the medical field, but there's so many different benefits. And in particular, you have focused quite a bit on the business benefits, which again is of particular interest to the people working here at BizDojo and Collider Wellington, and probably behind you where you are. So what is it about open data that's going to revolutionize and really sort of speed up innovation and productivity and commercializing open data?
Well, you know, there's a lot of ways this can happen, and as you mentioned, the team that I work with here at our center and I were originally met at the GovLab at NYU. We were the leads on the Open Data 500 project, which I know you're going to have Beth Novak on as well, which is terrific. We work very closely with Beth, and the GovLab is continuing the Open Data 500 work as we've looked at other ways of getting at similar kinds of issues. But that was a challenge to identify 500 US-based companies that used open data as a key business resource. And that work has now been replicated in Australia and Mexico. It's going on in Italy and Korea. And what happens when you look at all these companies using open data is you see a couple of things that are pretty striking. One is it's not just startups, although those are sometimes the most visible. It's also existing companies. A company here like Walmart, for example, is going to use a lot of weather data, GPS data, other transportation data to figure out how to get their shipment of goods to match the demand in different parts of the country, which could change with weather, with season, with all kinds of factors. On the other hand, you see a lot of startups now. The one that one of the ones I interviewed for my book, and I think the kind of biggest success story that people like to talk about recently is the Climate Corporation, which developed what's now being called precision agriculture. And what they realized is that there was an incredible kind of treasure trove of U.S. government data available from satellites, from ground readings, and so on, that really made it possible to put together data on weather, soil conditions, farming conditions, all this other stuff. So you could actually go to farmers and say, you know what, we can actually analyze, we can look at, you know, a space that's maybe 10 meters by 10 meters on your farm from space and tell you exactly what you want to plant, when you want to plant it, and how you can increase your crop yield by 20%. They're now a billion-dollar company that's been bought by Monsanto, so that gets everybody's attention. But we're seeing very, very similar kinds of things in real estate, in financial and investment services, in healthcare services, that the paradox of open data is that it's a free resource anyone can use, but if you can figure out how to use it in an especially smart way, through data analytics, through a new business model, through new ways of combining different data sets together, you can have a very, very successful business. And we're seeing tons of people starting to do that now.
Well, and that again ties into a discussion we've had here, which is, you know, why would some people hold data or hug it, as you said, and be gatekeepers of data? And there's this fear that, yes, well, if I give it away free, then I don't have the opportunity to sell it as well, which is not necessarily the case. And the examples that you bring up, I think Zillow was the real estate one. If anyone wants to look that one up, it's not here in New Zealand, but fascinating. Also, we have a slide. This is a 2013 McKinsey & Company report that says that there is an estimated $3 trillion annual economic potential. $3 trillion, and that's just for 1 year of monetizing the resource of open data. So, and that's part of what you're studying is trying to quantify more the value of open data. Is that correct?
That's right, and there's a lot of work now trying to quantify that. You know, when you say $3 trillion, it kind of gets people's attention. So I think the study that came out a few years ago was extremely important in sort of showing the kind of goal for what open data could be worth. To be honest, most studies have not shown that degree, and it's partly, I think, because McKinsey looked at a lot of what they would call downstream effects. Like if you open up data on education, eventually people get a better education, they get better jobs, it adds to the economy that way. So it's sort of hard to measure that. However, we've been continuing to track this. I've seen a lot of estimates now that show in different countries that open data is contributing somewhere between 1% and 2% of GDP, which is, it's a small single-digit percentage, but when you're looking at the entire GDP of a country, it's extremely significant and definitely shows the return on investment for going to the trouble of releasing data in a usable form.
So one of the things you said in your book where the promises of open data include hot new startups, tools and services for smart investing, which we can investigate a little bit further, strategies for savvy marketing, and new forms of fast innovation. So before we delve into those, and I also want to get back to the idea of climate change as well, I do want to invite our viewers to tweet their questions to hashtag Open Data Leadership so that it won't just be me asking all of the questions here today. But so smart investing, savvy marketing, fast innovation, these are all buzzwords. What do they translate into when you actually put them in the open data context?
Well, all of these examples come from real companies and real uses of open data. Take smart investing for starters. There's a company here, I think the company's called Analytics Insight. They had an application called Capital Cube, but there are many others like this as well. They realized that traditional investing, if you really want to get down to the level of individual equities, the analysis might be done every couple of weeks, maybe every couple of months. They now are able to take all 40,000 publicly traded equities for which there's sufficient information. There's a few thousand more where there's just not much information on them. And they now do an update every single day, not just of the stock price, which is easy, but of things like risk calculations. You can go on any day and see an up-to-the-minute graph of how different kinds of investments in a specific sector meet your investment needs around risk, around possible return, around any factor you want to look at. So we're really seeing, much, much more powerful investment tools than we've ever had. And that's just one example of the kinds of analysis that's being done.
So that's data-driven, not sort of the Warren Buffett style, go with your gut kind of investing. Strategies for savvy.
I think what I would say is, I would just say your gut tells you where to look, and the data tells you a little bit more what to do with your gut feelings.
Wonderful. You marry the two. Very, very diplomatic answer. Strategies for savvy marketing. And also, I want to bring up the phrase sentiment analysis, and I'll let you describe what that is.
Yeah, sentiment analysis is a wonderful concept, and it's really fascinating. It's the way I talk about it sometimes is if Jane Austen and Alan Turing had a love child, it would be sentiment analysis, because it really is very much about human sentiment and computation at the same time. So sentiment analysis, this is the kind of open data that comes from Twitter, that comes from social media, which you might want to call semi-open data. I mean, technically anybody can look at any Twitter feed that's out there. To really analyze it, you usually have to pay for an intermediary who can sort of organize the billions and billions of tweets we're seeing all the time. But the idea is that you can use more and more sophisticated approaches to this kind of data to find out what people think about a stock, about your brand, about a movie star, about anything. So it becomes a very, very important tool for brand management and marketing. And I would say now sentiment analysis has it's a combination of human work and computation. They have probably an accuracy rate of 80 to 85%, so you can't bet everything on it. But if you're trying to get real-time, real insight into how your brand is doing and how people think about your brand, it can be invaluable.
Certainly get a lot of people's attention. Fast innovation.
Well, this is the kind of thing that we were talking about before around the climate corporation or the investment companies, and we're just seeing open data being applied now in just about every sector: energy, education, healthcare, a lot of work, and a lot of innovative companies that are now springing up to help facilitate the use of open data. So analytics companies, data management companies, and so on. It really has the potential to accelerate innovation because it provides the raw materials for new ventures and new work. So in most new ventures, you would have to, if we did not have this store of open data, and you wanted to do what the Climate Corporation is doing, you'd have to start by sending up a whole bunch of satellites, which is going to be beyond, although there are private companies doing that now, but it's not an easy entry into the market. The amazing thing about this is that there's billions and billions of dollars worth of data that's ready to be used, so that you now can skip that whole stage of accumulating the raw materials of information and just figure out how to use them analytically, how to use them creatively, how to use them in a new business model. So the way in which the open data can work as an accelerator is tremendous.
I remember reading something about Pulse Point, which was an app I believe somebody came up with that could help. So you couldn't get emergency services quickly, but you could sort of type in, I need someone who could help in a cardiac arrest situation. So yeah, these kinds of things save lives and are sort of socially good and also make a profit.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm going to read some questions. Sorry about the delay. I did not mean to talk over you there. I'm going to read some questions sent in by people on Twitter, since we were just talking about social media.
Okay.
With government data repackaged and sold by companies in new formats, in those cases, who owns the data?
So who owns the data? It depends a little bit on what country you're in. I'm not positive how this works in New Zealand, but if it's open data, then by definition, the government has said everybody owns it. It's like in the public domain. In the U.S., we happen to have laws that say that any federal publication is automatically in the public domain, cannot be copyrighted. The U.K. has somewhat different laws that varies country to country. But by definition, if you're using open data, the data is publicly owned. The application is yours, right? So what would be copyrightable, trademarkable, patentable, not my area of expertise, but whatever it would be that would be appropriate, all of that would apply to, for example, it's the difference between Zillow and the underlying real estate data or deeds of sale or whatever that are publicly available. Zillow itself has value and is owned by people.
Yeah, and I think my understanding is that in some cases data that is sold sometimes is sold to private companies and those private companies own it. But I could be wrong about that. So it's definitely something to investigate if you're thinking of investing in open data. The risks of data, the risks of data hugging, and how do we avoid those risks?
Well, it is culture change. It is culture change. So a lot of work that we do at the Center for Open Data Enterprise is very much about that. I can tell you what we found in the U.S. and in some other countries as well, is that wherever you go and talk about open data, these days you're very likely to find some change agents. We go into federal agencies, somebody will call us up and say, I've heard about your work, I really want to get things moving in whatever the agency is. Can you come in, do an event, do a roundtable where we can bring together our data providers, people who use the data, and really get things moving. You see similar kinds of things with business innovators all over the world, with government entrepreneurs all over the world. So I think the key is finding the people who are really willing to move things forward and figuring out, as a data advocate, how to work with them, how to help them. And in addition, one of the things that I think is very important now, and your reader, if you search for this, you'll find it. If you search for Open Data Charter, this is a new initiative. It's international. Our group has been involved in creating it. And the people running the charter, which is an international group that manages it, are hoping to get countries to sign on to the basic principles that are there. And these are basic principles about how open data should be released, how it should be accessed, etc. The more countries adopt these principles, the less risk there is for people in any government agency anywhere to push for open data, because now they have a lot of companies. So I think that kind of international work can also be very helpful.
And since we're talking about companies, this might be an appropriate time to distinguish open data from big data, and you describe them as philosophically different.
Yeah. So big data, everybody has a different definition of big data. Everybody has a different definition of open data, but everybody does define them differently from each other. So big data, you can say, is really about the characteristics of the data Open data is really almost more a philosophical approach to the data, as you said. So with big data, people talk, I think the simplest way to think about it is this is the kind of data that is now testing the absolute limits of our ability to manage and do computational work with data of that size. So these tend to be very large data sets, as the name implies. They also tend to change very rapidly. They tend to have a lot of different factors in them. They're just very hard to analyze. But with improving computer technology, we can do more and more. So an interesting thing about big data is that what's considered big data today, 10 years from now, that might just be considered ordinary data because computers would be so much better, our techniques would be that much better. So it's really kind of defined by the data itself, how big it is, how hard it is to work with. Open data is completely different. Open data can be anything from billions of data points from NASA that shows satellite imagery of the world to a small town, New Zealand or America, releasing its budget to its 10,000 residents. The important thing is not about the quality of the data. Well, quality is important. The important thing is not about the quantity of the data, the complexity of the data, any of that. It's simply whether or not everybody can access it and whether everybody can reuse it in whatever way they want. Reuse it, analyze it, and publish the results. So there are places where these two things come together. A lot of the most valuable open data is very large government data sets on weather, census data, the economy, whatever. But there are different concepts that can also operate quite differently.
Yes, I remember watching a TED talk about open data being each particular tree in the city was considered a data point. So it can be anything, as you said. Going back now to the topic of climate change, because that is certainly on topic and very much important to New Zealand as well as everyone else, but definitely on our minds down here. Open data can solve some of society's biggest problems, but can you tell us more about how it can tackle these issues like climate change that threaten us all?
Sure. Well, I'm glad you asked about that because that's actually one that our center is very interested in right now. So one of my colleagues from the center and I were lucky enough to be able to go to the COP21 climate talks in Paris, and we ran a side event focused on the use of open data to fight climate change. Without being too self-promoting, but it's free, so I think this is fine. If anyone who's listening to this, if you want to search Huffington Post and my name, you'll find a blog post I did recently about open data and climate change, which I hope is helpful and has a lot of links and references in it. But what's very interesting here is that the whole concept of data and climate is changing in a very positive way and one that's very much enabled by the Paris Agreement. So I'd say for, I don't know, maybe 10 years, the use of data, the way that environmental organizations and governments have used data to fight climate change has been very simple. We look at temperature, we look at rates of Arctic ice melting, we look at everything happening to the planet, and we wave a flag saying, this is terrible, we've got to do something. All of that has been incredibly important in getting us to where we are now, where there is actually some international action starting to happen. But that's not the only thing you can do with data. There's at least 3 other ways that open data can now be used in the climate battle. One is to improve resilience. So we hear a lot about cities trying to become resilient by figuring out, what is the likely flood rise going to be? What's their risk of severe weather and so on. There's a lot of work now figuring out how to do city-by-city analysis that will help plan for of climate change that are now inevitable and help minimize the human and the economic cost. Flip side of that is mitigation. What can we do to actually slow this thing down? And what you're seeing there in a number of areas is real work where data is a tremendous enabler of renewable energy. There's a company in India, for example, that uses open data to figure out what are the best places to put solar energy collectors or wind power based on wind patterns, solar patterns, all this kind of stuff. You're seeing that, all over the world in different ways, and I think you'll see it increasingly. Or doing an economic analysis of projected changes in the price of solar versus the price of oil and so on. All of these are uses of data that can actually help us slow climate change down and ultimately reverse it. And then finally, as we move into the area of international agreements, there's going to be a very important monitoring and enforcement role here. There's a very interesting new company called Planet Labs that is sending up a ton. I think there's going to send up about 150 very small satellites that will make it possible to get a complete view of the Earth every 24 hours. What this means is that if a country is violating the climate agreements and, for example, starting forest fires or doing deforestation, the international community can see that within 24 hours. And as we get more and more sophisticated data about emissions releases and all of that, it'll really be possible to hold countries to their agreements. So in all these ways, I think we're right at a tipping point now. The role of data in climate is becoming incredibly important and very hopeful.
So, and that leads me into the next question. How will data help deliver the new Sustainable Development Goals, which I think in part you have just answered?
Well, I think the environmental ones are very important, and actually, I'm just referring to all my recent blog posts here, but our team did do a blog post on this for the World Bank blog recently, which you can find there. We actually did an exercise because the two of us work as consultants to the World Bank on open data. We did an exercise recently where we went through all 17 SDGs, and you can see it on this World Bank blog post, and said, in each case, how can open data actually make a difference? And you really can see that it has the power across all the SDGs. I mean, look at poverty, fighting poverty. There's a lot of work now on how open data can actually lead to economic growth, not just through creating new businesses, but helping match people to jobs that are really going to be best for them and where they can really be productive. All the environmental work, kind of agriculture work that we were talking about with Climate Corporation. Healthcare, we haven't talked about as much, but that's a huge area, both in helping people, particularly in developing countries, find better healthcare, find affordable medications, find clinics, all that kind of thing, and on and on. So energy production. So I think what we're seeing is that open data, is being used in countries like the U.S., the U.K., New Zealand, but it also is a very powerful tool for developing economies. And again, it's one of the most powerful, inexpensive resources that entrepreneurs can use. In that sense, I think it has tremendous power.
So I'll ask you two questions. What is the sort of danger or risk if open data is underutilized?
Well, there's a couple of different risks. One level is that all these things that we've been talking about don't happen. So people don't see dramatic improvements in medical care, they don't see dramatic improvements in agriculture, they're missing opportunities for economic development, for new jobs, and so on. So it's not something you would necessarily notice, because it's hard to notice the absence of something that's just starting to happen. But I think if you analyzed it, you would see that there's a true economic cost and a true social cost of not proceeding. The other area is that open data, we've talked a lot about the kinds of open data that can be applied in business and in other ways, but there is a whole kind of open data about keeping government accountable. This is about making sure that we all know what salaries our ministers are making, or what their expense statements look like, or knowing who governments are contracting with and what those contracts look like. And there's a lot of work now, including by a lot of the people here at the Open Gov Hub, working to ensure that data is available for that kind of good government accountability and transparency. And I think if that went away, we would really see some serious impacts very quickly. We would see governments just much less accountable to their citizens and much more corrupt.
Well, and you introduced this idea of government, and so this will lead us into this idea of open government revolution. What are the rules and parameters of open data when it comes to open government?
Well, open government, it's like open government also means different things, some of which are data, some of which are not. For example, open government can mean things like simply finding ways to get citizens working with government online with suggestions or with questions and so on. But the part where data and open data and open government come together is a lot of what I was just talking about, I think. A lot of it is about transparency and accountability. And the open data movement really began, probably you could say about 10 years ago, with a very, very strong focus on those kinds of issues. Groups like the Sunlight Foundation here in the U.S., or Open Knowledge, which is now all over the world, formerly Open Knowledge Foundation. They've really pushed for these principles of open data as an important part of open government. I think what's really most central here is to identify the kinds of data and the kinds of information that are going to be most important. So contracting, for example, I mentioned before, we've done some work with a new organization called the Open Contracting Partnership that is all about setting standards for every country in the world that say, what do you have to reveal about the companies you're contracting with? And this has tremendous implications. It's not only to make sure that a minister is not, paying his brother-in-law to do construction work, but it also opens up these markets, for small companies that otherwise could not compete with the big incumbent contractors. Now they know what the government is going for. Now they know what's winning contracts. Now they can get in there and compete with a more efficient, lower cost kind of solution. So that whole area of data-driven government and also using data within government to make better policy decisions, huge part of open government.
Well, and a lot of people will be very happy to hear about that, because that is always a sort of a nitpicky point for some people, that they're just not getting access to the data that would give them a fair shot at getting some of those contracting opportunities. And probably nitpicky isn't the right word. It's a very valid point. How do you, though, sort of ensure that government data is, well, how do you ensure its integrity, and how do you limit liability?
So, well, that's a tough one, and I'd say everybody working in this area is trying to figure that out. But there are a couple of creative solutions. I mean, I think one is the more that we have international norms around open government, the easier it'll be to see who's dodging those norms. But, it is very, very difficult. I mean, if you go to a corrupt government and ask them to release data showing how corrupt they are, you might not get the best cooperation, or it will be, subverted in different ways. But one really interesting approach to that, and then I'll talk about liability in a second, but one really interesting approach to the accuracy problem is having citizens themselves monitor what's going on and provide data. So there's a New York-based company called Google, which operates in many countries around the world, and they monitor the extractives industry, right? So there's a lot of international regulations about monitoring and providing data about oil, coal, gas, and so on. The data may not always be reliable, so they have people on the ground with cell phones, and they have, because every country now has a ton of mobile phones, and they have a way that people can anonymously provide information about what's happening at that coal plant right down the street. They collect the information, they standardize it, they actually, their business, I mean, some of their customers are companies themselves, where they say, look, this is what is happening, do you want this to go public, or do you want to fix it? And I think we're going to see more and more ways in which that kind of crowdsourced data and official government data starts to come together in interesting ways. On liability, because government agencies tend to be pretty risk averse, I think everywhere in the world, they're not likely to run into liability issues. They're more likely to hold back data out of fear of liability. But there are some really interesting cases around this too. And one of the things we're seeing is that the laws change and liability changes. So we had a real landmark case here in the U.S. A couple of groups, one including the Wall Street Journal, really wanted to get access to data about our Medicare system and how different doctors were charging patients on the Medicare, because they figured there are just some doctors out there who are overcharging. Investigative reporters have been trying to get this information for about 30 years, and more than 30 years ago, a judge said, you can't release it, government can't release it, because that invades the privacy of these doctors. They went at it, and I think about 2 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, a new judge came down with a new decision that says, you know what, public priorities have changed, our perception of privacy has changed, release the data. So, the Health and Human Services Department in the U.S. government would have been liable if they'd done it before. Now they have a legal protection and, in fact, an order to do it. That data has come out, and we've seen things like an ophthalmologist somewhere in, I think, Florida making $20 million a year. So it has been a very effective tool to really zero in on some of the fraud in that system.
I think.
Whoops.
Yep, that goes back to the idea of culture change. I think I was muted there for a second.
Yeah,
I'm going to go ahead and ask a couple more questions that people have tweeted in. How do we help people understand the data if they don't have the tools or the time?
Sure. So we don't expect, I'm saying we, our organization, but I think most people in this field don't really expect that a lot of people are going to go directly to a government data set and say, let me download this and analyze it. What we are seeing, though, is a number of intermediaries scrutiny. So I think for people who have the technical skill and the business interest in trying to create a new travel site, a new health site, whatever it is, there's tremendous opportunity. For the rest of us, and I'm not a technologist myself, so I count myself in the rest of us. For the rest of us, I think we're going to see more and more opportunities in these tools. Some of them are going to be provided by government, some of them are going to be provided by business, some will be provided by nonprofit organizations, some will be things you have to pay for. Most, I think, will be things that are either low cost or relatively free because there's a public expectation that you ought to be able to access data without paying a fortune. So I think it's not essential to be a technologist to figure out how to do this. What is important, I think, is to sort of understand the concept, to find places to look. For example, a lot of government websites that provide data also highlight applications that people might not know about that are using the data in creative ways, and to figure out how to access the tools that may be data-driven that are going to be helpful to you.
Really that's what it comes down to, data-driven, being informed citizens, and we're going to talk more with Beth Novak about that in a see-through society, democracy, but also consumers, and that's what drives so much of our interest in what's happening in our world is us as consumers. So smart disclosure, which we'll ask you about in a minute, is a very important part of this. But in your book, you say open data changes the world for entrepreneurs, established businesses, governments, investors, scientists, journalists, and consumers. And smart disclosure is very much your sort of cause célèbre in your background. So what exactly is that? Because there are a lot of terms in this space that we want translated, and how does it benefit us?
Sure. So, so smart disclosure, I mean, just a little bit of my background very quickly. I worked for about 15 years at Consumer Reports magazine here. I'm sure I know there's a New Zealand equivalent. I can't think of the name. In the UK, it's Which magazine, but it's basically, the magazine that tells you what to buy based on a lot of testing. So I was always very interested in the use of data for consumer benefit. I was tapped a few years ago to head the Consumer Bureau at our Federal Communications Commission, and the chairman wanted to answer one question. He said, how can we use data to help people figure out what cell phone and cell phone plan to buy? So this turned out to be nearly impossible. And I understand that IBM Watson, the computer that won Jeopardy, is now trying to figure this out. So we could not figure it out at the FCC, but in the process of that, I talked to a lot of people throughout government and the federal agencies here who were looking at different ways to apply data to help solve consumer problems. And as a result of that, I was invited to chair a White House task force on what we called smart disclosure. And we defined smart disclosure as using open data, government data, to help consumers figure out what to buy and to help to improve consumer markets in the US and New Zealand, around the world. We're seeing now more and more, two things are happening. One is that government agencies are releasing more and more of this data. So we have something here now called the College Scorecard, where the Department of Education has put together this terrific tool that parents and students can use to say, okay, if you go to this college, what is your salary likely to be based on the average of graduates 10 years from the time you start? And you see tremendous variation, including among colleges that are intellectually very prestigious, but the earning potential of these kids varies tremendously depending on the college. So if that's something that you as a parent paying tuition are concerned about, you can now find that out due to government data being released. There's government data on hospital safety, all kinds of things. And we're seeing a number of new companies starting up as well to try to make that data really accessible to people.
So then who should be paying for the data? If consumers benefit along the sort of continuum, who hands the money over to get access? Because in some cases, as you say, open data should be free, but it is actually sold.
Yeah, it's, again, this varies a lot country to country. In the UK, for example, they've had real battles about whether or not the government should be allowed to charge for postal addresses or, the ordnance survey, the basic kind of geospatial survey. In the US, we don't have this at a federal level because all the data is free, but we have a whole issue with the state of Delaware, which is where so many companies incorporate. It's very hard to get at that data without paying a lot for it, and that's why a lot of companies essentially launder their money through the state of Delaware. So I think more and more, and the Open Data Charter says this, and more people in the kind of growing open data community would say simply that government data has to be available for free. Now, what you do with it, you can charge for it. So, you know, if you take a lot of data and you add tremendous value by analyzing it in a new way, publishing it in a new way, looking at the aspects of the data, it's fair to charge for that. But I think there's really a growing consensus that government data should either be free or as close to free as possible. And in a couple of countries or instances where governments have gone from charging to data to making it available for free, we see tremendous increases in how widely it's used.
We are, I know, coming up close to the end here. We have a few more questions, and they're rather large. One is, what is the government's role and responsibility with open data, which to some degree we've answered. What is the most important way to measure the impact of open data, which is directly what you're working on, and what is the ideal governance model for government's open data programs? So that's a lot to throw at you, but if you don't mind touching on some touch points, that would be appreciated.
Sure. So I think, so first just sort of speaking to government responsibility and what the government's role should be, I think it's very important to realize not all data is equal. We kind of talk a lot here about an 80-20 rule, that probably about 20% of the data has 80% of the value. That's, you know, to be honest, a guess, but there's some anecdotal evidence that's right. It's not that, maybe it's not 10, maybe it's not 30, but the point is, not all government data has equal value. A lot of the work that we do here at the Center for Open Data Enterprise is about bringing together data users with data providers, so the businesses and academics and others who are using government data can say, hey, you know what? These three kinds of census data are incredibly important. The other stuff, not so much. So I think the government responsibility is not like, say, make all your data high quality and incredibly useful overnight, because that's impossible. I think it's more like the responsibility is find out who's using it, find out what they're using it for, and make sure that those really important data sets are really valuable. So I'd say that's the answer to that. I'm sorry, I somehow got so involved in that question I forgot the other.
I threw a lot at you. Remember, what is the most important way to measure the impact of open data, which is part of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, impact, but impact really does remain a very difficult one for people, and there's a lot of work now trying to measure the impact of open data. It's not going to be easy, but I think we also have to be careful that we not go about it the wrong way. So the analogy I like to use is that, you know, I'm from New York, right, originally. If somebody says to me, what's the value of a square mile of real estate in the United States, if I look around me in New York City and I look at a square mile of Manhattan, it's going to be a very different answer than if I'm standing in the middle of the Nevada desert. So just saying what's the value of open data, it's a very general and generic question. I think when we get into this, we're going to be asking questions like, what's the value of agriculture data and certain kinds of agriculture data? What's the value of health data and certain kinds of health data? I think as we really start drilling in, it's going to become a much more answerable question. And I think the other thing that will be very interesting to try to do is we're going to see more and more instances where government decides to open up data that's never really been open and available before. If we can find those instances or even help encourage them, we can then track what changes once the data is available. And I think if we sort of go from just looking around and seeing who's doing what to seeing the kind of change that happens when open data is liberated, as it were, I think we're going to start being able to measure impact much more quickly.
Data liberation, another one of those great terms, and the impacts can be measured both economically but also in social good, and you talk about health data and drug companies collaborating now and sharing, coming up with potentially life-saving medicines. The ideal governance model for government open data programs, and that's a huge one. So if you can direct us to some writings.
That could be it. That's the kind of question where I'm glad we're near the end of our time.
Yes.
That's a very big one. But I would say the most important thing about governance models is everybody should have one for the data they're releasing. The Open Data Charter that I talked about earlier deals with this to some degree. I think what we're realizing, and you know, that's actually kind of a serious answer. I mean, it's very complex, whether you're talking about governance around privacy issues, governance around accessibility to data. There's so many issues here, but certainly in the privacy arena, there's been a lot of writing about how governance is critical to figuring out how to manage these data sets in an appropriate way. And as the Open Data Charter points out, we think there are some really basic principles that can be applied across the board, across countries.
Waiting for it to be unmuted. One of the biggest challenges, though, is it's not just understanding open data as a concept, but becoming more data literate as a society, so that we all understand the stake that we hold in this topic. And I think that that's part of what we're trying to do here today, is to improve data literacy. So I told you, as we debriefed before this, that I would ask you to describe a day in the life of an ideal open data world. So what did you come up with?
Yeah, well, I've been thinking about that. That was a great question. So I'm going to pose a hypothetical. So I've always wanted to be an investigative reporter for the Washington Post. So I'll tell you, if I were one, and if I had, certain things going on in my life, this is what it might be like. So I wake up in the morning. I live in one of the suburbs here. I live in Silver Spring, Maryland. Got to figure out how to get to work. There's 2 bus routes and a metro that I can take. I immediately go online. I figure out, how they're running, what next one is coming, and which one I ought to take. And by the way, these examples I'm going to talk to you about in this hypothetical day, some of them are here now, some of them will be here very soon. I get into work. Most of my day is spent doing a major investigation on, of all things, government salaries, expenses, and particularly campaign finance, and how different campaign finance patterns affect the voting of members of Congress. I leave early because my daughter is a high school senior. We're trying to figure out what college she should go to, and we're meeting with her college counselor, and we're going to look at that college scorecard, because I really don't want to pay a huge amount of money in tuition and then have her, not be able to get a job 10 years out of college or not be able to get a good job. So we're actually going to look at the value of that education. I do have a doctor's appointment after that. I've been having a little trouble with my cholesterol, but I'm involved now in a clinical trial that is taking all of my genomic data. They're actually looking at my DNA. They're comparing my treatment and the outcome I can expect based on my DNA and the DNA of millions of other people in what's called the Precision Medicine Initiative here in the U.S., which is trying to tailor medicines and medications to individuals based on open data. I get home, my wife and I are working on 2 different things. Number one is we're hoping to sell our house and move now that our daughter's going to be out of the house. We're looking for a really great area next to a lot of parkland where the schools don't have to be that great because we don't have kids at home anymore. So we go on Zillow and we begin to do our search and narrow down what works for us. But at the same time, we're planning a vacation over the summer. The Department of the Interior has a fantastic new website where we can go and find exactly the kind of place that we want to go based on our budget, based on seasonal availability. We decide to go to Yosemite in California. And then just before bed, I check the weather, which is one of the most enduring and established applications of open data we have, and that's it for the day.
Well, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you. And I think when you paint a picture like that, it just makes it crystal clear how important this is to our daily lives. And hopefully that will make us both more data literate, but also recruit more data champions out there. So Joel Gurin, I really appreciate you joining us today. You're one of the foremost experts in the world, so we certainly appreciate all the time and attention that you've given this topic. And I am going to ask for a slide because there's a simple definition of open data that I love. Open data is data with a mission. And I think I need to credit you with that. I think it's excellent. But as I read that, I also want to point out that, there are a few slides there. There we go. Well, open data is data anyone can access, use, and share. And then there's one that says it's just data with a mission. But I want to point out that New Zealand is ranked 4th equal in the world with France, and that's behind the US, UK, and Sweden, according to Open Government, for allowing access to open government data. And the Land Information Minister, Louise Upston, said government agencies are beginning to view data and information as key public assets, the release of which can play a significant role in driving innovation through better decision-making and the creation of new services, tools, and knowledge. And it is a very broad statement, but we have had the chance to dive into this a little bit today. So thank you for clarifying some of that for us, for educating me, and hopefully informing those viewers out there who've joined us today on this Google Hangout. Next is your collaborative partner, Beth Novak, and so I look forward to speaking with her a little bit more about the government and open government side of that. But in the meantime, thanks very much, and we'll see you again here from BizDojo and Collider Wellington from Wellington, New Zealand. Take care.
Thank you so much, and keep the open data mission going.
Will do.